Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this recorded Zoom event. We're gathered together to talk about the horribly prevalent problem of criminal debt in North Carolina, a problem that we think is incredibly urgent. It was urgent before, and it's all the more urgent given the economic impacts of COVID in our state. Just yesterday, the Center for Science and Justice, which I directed to, launched a report describing how in 1.7 million cases total and over 100,000 cases a year, the courts in North Carolina have imposed fees that a person can't, does not, almost certainly will not pay. But the consequences of these failure to comply with these court orders can be quite serious, even though the cases are often petty cases, traffic cases, infractions. There's millions and millions of dollars of this debt. We do a back of the hand estimate. It could be well over $140 million. And it disproportionately burdens minority residents, leads to other serious costs like driver's license suspensions. We're here today with Christy Puckett-Williams from the North Carolina ACLU, who among her many roles manages the statewide campaign for smart justice. She's a scholar of mass incarceration, focuses on treatment of pregnant women in custody. Recently governor appointed chair of the Women in Incarceration Work Group in North Carolina. She's been traveling the state, attending roundtables on pretrial practices hosted by the Attorney General, and it has powerful stories to tell of her own experiences and is an incredibly powerful, tireless advocate. Next, we'll hear from Will Crozer here at Duke, a psychologist, a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Science and Justice, and he'll give us just a quick tour of a data website that we created with shows county level information, statewide information. We're hoping that it'll be a useful tool for advocates, for lawyers. Speaking of lawyers, next we'll hear from Christina Becker from the North Carolina ACLU. She's now a capital mitigation specialist, but just prior to her recent death penalty work, she was a criminal justice debt fellow and produced a really important, remarkable report that described not just the scope of these fines and fees, but also the process and consequences of these cases, including jail time. She's seen this firsthand. She was a public defender in Mecklenburg before her work at the North Carolina ACLU. Next, we'll hear from Daniel Bose at the North Carolina Justice Center. Certainly our work was made possible by his tireless work, including to encourage the Administrative Office of the Courts to share the kind of data that we were able to analyze. He directs the Fair Chance Criminal Justice Project at the Justice Center. He's a Duke alum. He had been an Autry Fellow at MDC, a supervising attorney at Legal Aid in North Carolina. He's with the Second Chance Employment and Housing Project. The advisory board of Our Children's Place has done work throughout the state to both advocate on criminal debt issues and on second chance issues, and to create programs to help to restore people's rights. Next, we'll hear from Whitley Carpenter, a staff attorney at Forward Justice. She had been at the Southern Coalition, worked with Jean Nickel and Catherine Kim as a student at UNC Law. And finally, for a national picture, we'll turn to Joanna Weiss at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, which she's a co-founder and co-director of. She had been a director of criminal justice at the Lauren John Arnold Foundation, now Arnold Ventures, served on the National Task Force on Fines and Fees, and serves on an ABA working group to address fines and fees. And then to conclude things, Tom Maher, our new executive director here at the Center for Science and Justice, will pose some questions to the group about what you can do about this problem of criminal debt. He was the former director of Indigent Defense Services in North Carolina until just a few weeks ago. He started with us at Duke on March 3rd. So Christy, would you like to start us off by talking about how, especially post-COVID, criminal debt is an urgent issue now in our state?
Thank you, Brandon. It is, and hey, everybody. We are in the midst of a public health and an economic crisis right now. And as a result, there are now 26 million unemployed people. And so a recession is underway. People are losing their jobs, and most low-paying jobs, can't be done remotely. So families are unable to pay their rent. They can't buy food. They can't afford medical care. And they need their cars to access these basic necessities while social distancing. So if their driver's licenses are suspended due to criminal debt, that's definitely an issue. And so in the midst of this crisis, paying fees or fines or accumulating additional court debt should be the last thing that a family should have to worry about. And people who are incarcerated are particularly vulnerable to COVID. And so the conditions in jails and prisons, coupled with the age and the health of the incarcerated population, makes the virus extremely dangerous. So many jurisdictions in jails and prisons have terminated in-person visitation, which means that family and friends now have to rely on exorbitant phone calls and emails and other vital forms of communication that they pay fees for. And we saw during the last recession that state and local governments dramatically increased the number and amount of fees and fines imposed on people for, as you noted, minor traffic violations, as well as municipal code violations, misdemeanors and felonies. And they do that so they can fill budget gaps. And so it's a regressive tax system that continues to cause enormous harm in Black and brown communities. As you noted, that most of this stems from minor traffic violations that result in more fees and fines that people won't pay, can't pay. I mean, it's not even like a won't, it's can't. Then like, if you lose your driver's license, y'all, like, it's more fines. And then if you continue to drive out of necessity because you may not live in an area where public transportation is accessible or something that you can do, your job might not be on the bus route. I mean, it's so many things that happen. And so you get driving with a revoked license. And then that can lead to you being incarcerated. And then we're talking about more fees and fines. So bail fees and fines. It's just, with courts being closed, people not being able to go to court, some people can't even address the issues that they already have. And so people are more at risk for having fees and fines assessed and things weren't even addressed. And as you noted, this is overwhelmingly affecting Black and brown people. Over half of the people in our state who are trapped in this debt cycle, as your report noted, are Black, even though Black people only make up a quarter of the state's population. And other studies have shown that Black people are 62 times more likely to be pulled over by the police. So the over-policing of Black and brown communities has definitely contributed to the increased traffic stops, which drive the traffic convictions and the imposition of fees and fines, with no assessment or determination of a person's ability to pay those fees and fines, which in turn puts people at risk for continued poverty. And they continue to have involvement with our courts and our jails. This is something we should especially take note of in light of the economic crisis, because history has shown, again, that during times of economic downturn, government rely on poor people. This can foster collusion between government agencies. If we've learned anything from Ferguson, we can see that when government officials use law enforcement to generate revenue, it can lead to corruption and injustice. The city finance director in Ferguson explicitly urged both sides, the police chief and the city manager, to write more tickets in order to extract income for the county and state, often through unconstitutional stops and arrests. And so according to the DOJ report, law enforcement practices produced and exacerbated racial disparities. And so that is why the intersection of COVID, fees and fines, and the economy is such a huge topic today.
Thank you so much. Will, you now have co-hosting power.
All right, let me get my screen share going here. All right, this is a website that we set up to allow people to interface with the data set that we have worked with, that again, we got from Daniel Bose, so thank you very much for Daniel, and is kind of the foundation for the report that we published. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about these data, you don't have to be a data scientist, you don't have to be a statistician to use the website. So I just want to kind of give a quick overview and point out a lot of the points that Christy raised will, kind of confirm here. Basically you just go to this website here, datalab.law.duke.edu/shiny/NC-crim-fines, and we can share this link kind of separately as well. But what you come up with is initially a launch page. This launch page has some basic information about summarizing some of the trends that we found, such as the total number of FTCs in North Carolina, a lot of the stuff that you would see in the report. It also has a little bit of information about us, so I want to give a specific shout out to Caroline Levinson and Maria Tackett, who are a stats undergrad at Duke and a stats professor at Duke that helped us with this project. This wouldn't have been possible without them. But let's say that you're interested in maybe diving in a little bit deeper into these data. There's a couple different ways that you can do it. So this first tab here, the length of FTCs, if you click this, what it's going to give you is a bar chart of the number of people with specific FTC lengths. So for example, this is currently sorted for felonies. So I can go to no filter. So let's say you're interested in all the FTCs in North Carolina. These bar charts tell you the number of people and then the percentage of people that have this FTC that's lasted a specific length. So we find that a little under 200,000 people have a cured FTC that lasts longer than 30 days. This makes up probably around 10% of the observations we have. We can compare that to say something like this teal bar over here on the far right, where we see about 45% of people currently have an uncured FTC. And that's well over 600,000 people. So if you were interested, you can sort these data in a couple different ways. So let's say you're interested in what's going on in your county. So Duke is in Durham County, so we can go scroll through to Durham County. And what it'll actually do is it'll change these bar charts to reflect the data just in that county. So we can see the data actually changes considerably here. If you're interested in other factors, you can sort by those as well. So you can sort by different race. So if you only wanted to look at, say, Black people in North Carolina, the graphs change a little bit. So this would be Black people in Durham. We can also sort by different age groups, as well as by sex or by the type of charge you're interested in. So let's say you only want to look at traffic charges in Durham. You can sort by traffic charges, and you can see that there's quite a few of these traffic charges in Durham, and the traffic charges make up the majority of our data set in general, so that makes a lot of sense. If you're interested in, say, the demographics of the FTCs, you can go to this next tab. I apologize, it does take a little bit to load because it's pulling in a lot of data here. But you end up with a lot of the same options. So the first thing you'll notice here is these pie charts that look at FTCs broken down by race from our data, and then the North Carolina census data. So to reflect what Christy said, you see that there's a pretty large overrepresentation of Black people with FTCs compared to their representation of the overall population. If you scroll down, you can dive in a little bit deeper to this data. These data are box and whisker plots, which basically give you information about the median length of suspension, as well as how these suspensions are distributed based on length. There's also a table here, so if you're not a box and whisker plot, you can still get the same information from this table at the bottom. But again, you can sort these data based on what you're interested in. So you can sort by county, you can look at cured FTCs versus pending FTCs versus both. You can use the x-axis, you can split this up by race, sex, or age, or charge type, so you can actually sort this to compare things like felonies to infractions, to misdemeanors, to traffic cases. This top bar allows you to sort based on the length of the FTC. So let's say you're only interested in long-term FTCs, only the ones that have lasted longer than a year. You can take these sliders, you can go all the way up to the max, which is 12,000 days, and then you can set the minimum around a year and see how these data change. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use this page on demographics, but basically, however you sort it, it does demonstrate that minorities and people of color are particularly affected by these FTCs disparately from the representation in the population. If you go over to FTCs by county, this last tab is pretty interesting. Maybe if you're learning a little bit more about the geographics of these FTCs or of your county in particular. So we have some static heat maps here of the number of FTCs given by county. So the lighter the county, the more FTCs there are there. The second table shows the average length by county. And then if you're not great at reading these tables or you want to know more, you can actually go down here to this bottom part, which has a searchable function. So let's say you're particularly interested in Wake County, which has a lot of suspensions. You can type in Wake. It'll pull up just Wake County, and you can see that there are indeed a lot of suspensions. It shows you the max length, it shows you the mean length, the median length, and some information about how these data are distributed. So if you want to know more about maybe your specific county, you can learn about that on this page. And then finally, The last tab shows these FTCs impositions over time. So we can see the FTCs that are issued in any given year. And then we can also see the FTCs that are active per year. And the main thing that you can take away from this is that this is a growing issue. So over time, more and more FTCs are being put into place. More and more FTCs are being active per year. You'll notice the number is pretty small for 2020. That's because we only had the first 10 days in January for this data set, but there's still a lot of FTAs in a 10-day period. So this shows that both the direct and indirect of these FTCs are a growing problem. So things like driver's license suspension for traffic cases due to FTCs are going to be increasing more and more every year. It's just something Christy mentioned, and something we actually have another report on and a couple publications on from the Center for Science and Justice as well. So that is the website. I encourage anyone who's interested in diving more into the data to take a look at that. And we're always happy to receive feedback or comments or questions about it as well.
Great, thank you so much, Will. Daniel, let's turn it over to you now.
Good morning, good to be with y'all. You know, I was just reminded watching Will's presentation, just you know, how much I value this collaboration with Duke, and how much y'all have brought between the academic papers and the research capacity, and just you know, your reputation, and now we have this incredible tool that will be very helpful, sort of helping individual decision makers and county officials across the state understand the impact of this issue on their citizens. And so thank y'all again for all y'all have done for this. You know, as Brandon said at the beginning, my name is Daniel Bowes. I primarily work as a lobbyist at the North Carolina Justice Center, but I'm an attorney by credentialing, I guess. But, you know, something we've done at the Justice Center for the last several years is to work with members of the North Carolina Second Chance Lines. Shout out to Christy, others here, but and sort of listen to what impacted people, what needs they're facing, and then try to look in the statutes as they are written at that time, find any relief that is responsive, then partner with prosecutors in particular, but local elected officials in general, to maximize access to that relief and learn about the gaps. And so we did this first with expungements, and that's how we came to the issue of criminal justice debt and driver's license suspension, and what we generally think of as criminalization of poverty. And so, again, really appreciate the huge amount of partnerships that are happening here, not just with Duke, but also with the fines and fees working group, which, you know, Whitley, Christy and I are about to, when we end this meeting, we're about to get into that meeting. And so it's a huge issue, and it's been an issue. And as Christy and others have said, it's going to be even a more profound issue when we suffer what is likely to be, you know, a depression that's worse than the Great Depression. And so, you know, and so we're, as a coalition, we're trying to lift these issues up to decision makers now as urgently as ever. But I just want to spend my few minutes talking about sort of the political context here, and then some of the efforts that we've been able to collaborate with, and some of the relief efforts. You know, what's happening when you see that chart that Will put out last about this being a growing issue, that's for a couple reasons. One, you've seen states have to rely much more on fines and fees to generate revenue, not only for the court system, but they send it to the general fund of the state. And so there's a huge vested interest there. We saw this sort of the worst in Ferguson, and that's where this sort of got a national spotlight, where you saw municipal courts actually getting, you know, a huge portion of the revenue from traffic stops. Now, North Carolina is better as compared to that sort of situation, because we got rid of municipal courts in the 1950s. And so we do have a unified court system. And so you don't see sort of the extreme incentives for them to collect revenues locally, though you still have some revenues like the facilities fee that's $12 for every time somebody's goes into court in a local courthouse. You have the law enforcement retirement fee that goes back to the arresting agency. You have some other things there, it is a partial incentive, but it's indirect. So I actually think that generally that's one positive thing in North Carolina. You're not seeing some of those extreme local incentives to pull over people and generate revenues, but you still see it at the state level. And so what we see there is that you have two things happening. You have the fees dramatically rising over the past 20, 25 years. In 1995, the General Court of Justice fee was $41. Now it's $147.50. And that's what anybody who appears in court, whether it's for murder or expired registration, is charged if they're found responsible or guilty. But you have that fee, which is increased dramatically and is just sort of a show of just that steady rise that happens every legislative session. They add $2, $5, and that steady rise. But then you've also seen specific fees, both the breadth and the amount of fees increased. And so, you know, one of the most insidious, I think, is a jail fee that used to be $5. Now it's $10 per day. And this is charged to somebody who can't afford bail and has to wait to resolve their case while in prison. You can see how criminalization of poverty bleeds into justice, where it is a fundamentally different situation if you're considering a plea deal while sitting in a jail cell versus in the community. But you know, you get out, you're found guilty. We had one young woman describe her plight to Lauren Freeman, Wake County prosecutor, district attorney, and saying, you know, she spent 300 days in pretrial confinement, was acquitted of her most serious charge, and convicted of a low-level felony, let out that day and put on probation, or actually I think it was the next day. But was saying that as a term of her probation, she was expected to immediately begin paying her criminal justice debt, which was because she had been in jail and then found guilty, not of her most serious charge, but of any thing that she'd been charged with. That was $3,000 in pretrial confinement cost. Then she owed $250 for community service. She owed $40 per month for probation. And so, and a whole bunch of other fees that I'm not going to go through, but basically what she was saying, and what is the essential, one of the essential issues here, is that she felt like she was being set up to fail. That these fees were meant to exploit her, that maybe she would get, she'd be able to, just by luck, be able to actually pay them and stay out of prison, but more likely she would be end up getting her post-release or probation revoked and go to prison. And so it's an incredibly impactful and dire situation for a lot of people. As we said, it'll probably get worse over the next year as people are dealing with the pandemic. So you have the increased fees on this side. On the other side, you have this concerted effort by the state legislature to pressure judges not to waive the fees. And they've done this in several ways, you know, everything from creating procedural barriers where they have to do, you know, one year they started requiring them to do findings of fact, and the next year conclusions of law in addition to the findings of fact. And then there's different notice provisions that have been put up where you have to technically inform every agency, and there are more than 600 that potentially could lose revenues if the court waives fees or eliminates fees on the back end. Presumably you're supposed to send a letter by first-class mail to every one of those agencies anytime you're trying to consider this. And then finally, there was political pressure. And this is a context, I have to say that judges still have broad discretion to waive the fees, but there have been these barriers put up, and most notably is the political barriers and these reports that are meant to paint people as being soft on crime if they waive fees. But really all the reports show is the complete underuse of waivers. I mean, no county is anywhere close to the level that you would presume, knowing how many poor people are going through the court system. So it's not, if any sort of shocking evidence it provides, it's really the underuse. But it has had an incredible effect. Every time we go to a different jurisdiction, we ask for them to partner with us on our relief efforts, that comes up a lot of times, is that report, and not wanting retaliation by the state legislature, not wanting the voters to think that somebody is letting people get a free pass. So that's the situation, and I'll use my last 5 minutes by just saying sort of how it's responsive, and how the data helps here, and how what Duke has done is particularly helpful. It helps to be able to counter that conversation with showing you're not letting people all free here. Like they have suffered a suspension, and all the sort of uh, destructive impacts that Christy talked about, whether it's not driving at all and being completely isolated from opportunity and family and medical care, or oftentimes happens you continue to drive and get funneled further into the criminal justice system, whether that's probation or additional fines and fees, all that sort of stuff. And so, it's a huge issue. But what we can show to legislators using this data is that a couple things. One, if somebody has had a failure to pay for more than a year, then the chances of them paying off that debt is minimal. And so the vast majority of that debt that's more than a year old for traffic offenses is not going to be paid off. And so the choice between policymakers is not a choice between whether you collect that debt or are responsive to the dire needs of individuals who are suffering these suspensions, because you're not going to collect the debt anyway. And so and that's where sort of we begin the conversations with prosecutors who are coming to this issue willingly, because they see people coming in and out of the court system. They didn't go to law school to prosecute driving while license revoked, or most of them didn't. And so they're sympathetic to this issue, and even both on sort of a human toll, but also just court efficiency, and want to sort of what D.A. DeBerry, which has been one of the biggest leaders of this effort across the state, where she's motioning for the relief and has gotten rid of thousands of suspensions without having to bring people into court. I give a lot of credit to her and D.A. Merriweather. But what she's described is that this is about not only helping these individuals, but making the overall community safer. That, you don't want people driving around, a huge amount of people, without insurance, without registration. So actually understanding that these people have suffered a severe consequence, where the people we're helping in Durham, the average length of suspension is 14 years. And when you compare that to if you get a DWI conviction, which we as a society have reached consensus is one of the most extreme sort of driving offenses, you get convicted of that, that's a 1-year suspension. And yet you get convicted of not having a registration, and just because you can't pay the court costs and fines, which total $200, $300, that means that you indefinitely can't drive. And so I think that being able to point out the data here, being able to collect the stories, and especially now what Duke has done with this website, will make it much easier to go into communities, partner with prosecutors and local officials, try to get some of this debt gone. We've already done that in Mecklenburg and Durham. Pitt County is doing that this week, and there's some other places. And so again, I'll just close by thanking Duke for their partnership and leadership on these issues, and especially Professor Garrett and Will.
Thank you a million. It's thanks to the tireless work that you all are doing that we've been able to try to support your efforts. So Whitley, we'd love to hear more about the work that you all are doing at Forward Justice, including as part of some of the coalitions that Daniel was just talking about. Take it away.
Thank you for having me, Professor Garrett. And I want to thank Christy and Daniel. They've made my job a little easier as we work together closely a lot. I want to talk this morning a little bit about Forward Justice and how we approach this work, and kind of why this is important, particularly some of the efforts we've started after COVID-19. I'm an attorney with Forward Justice. We are a law policy and strategy center in Durham, North Carolina, and we advocate for racial, social, economic justice, generally by working with other organizations and coalitions at the forefront of social movements just across the South. And so I think in this context, one of the important strategies that we try to think about when doing all of our work is there an opportunity or chance to build law or to change law policy and practice in a way that builds power for the communities that we're in partnership with. And so I think that that's kind of how the Second Chance Alliance work fits in. So Daniel and Christy both mentioned Second Chance Alliance, which is a group of directly impacted people, service providers, concerned citizens, advocacy organizations, all working together to restore and advocate for opportunities for people who have had involvement in the criminal justice system so that they can re-enter society with the basic human rights that we all have, and to just eliminate some of those barriers and collateral consequences that people face when they have involvement in the criminal justice system. After, or I guess during and after law school, I worked for about 5 years, just mostly doing expungement work. And I just continuously saw people that were unable to clean their records because of unpaid debt. And then on addition to that, there was a fee to file an expungement. And then over and over again, as the years went on, there were people that were coming to our clinics that wanted to get their records expunged, but also get their driver's license restored. And so in an effort to kind of build that power and respond to community needs is really kind of how I got involved into the fines and fees work. I will say that since COVID-19 has started, we've kind of shifted our focus right now with Second Chance Alliance to decarceration efforts, like Christy mentioned earlier. And since mid-March, we've worked in coalition with a variety of social justice organizations and advocates to try to first encourage and insist and now demand that the state release some incarcerated people and protect them. And so, we've worked on social media campaigns and petitions and call-a-thons and storytelling and all types of tactics until we recently filed a lawsuit against the governor and the Department of Public Safety, asking that the court order our state leaders to abide by their duties to protect all North Carolinians and not subject those people who are incarcerated to cruel and unusual punishment. So I think in the context of all that, Daniel mentioned that when we're talking about fines and fees in North Carolina, we're talking about the criminalization of poverty. So Daniel mentioned the fact that the fees have risen to a minimum of $147 in court. And so we, at least at Forward Justice, believe that these fines and fees that our communities face daily in our court system are really just a modern day form of debt peonage. Which was a means of exploiting the Black community directly after the abolition of slavery. And so, Congress abolished debtors' prisons in 1833, and the US Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional, but still there are thousands of our people who are locked up for failing to pay their debts to the state. And so these are the exact types of laws and policies that we're hoping to change at Forward Justice in a way that builds power in our communities. I think one aspect of that is we also recently filed a lawsuit in North Carolina challenging the felony disenfranchisement laws. And one provision or one part of that is that, we talked about it being kind of a modern day poll tax, that some people remain on probation because of an inability to pay their fines and fees. And if that's a felony probation that is extended, that extends their inability to vote or their inability to gain their right to vote back. And so, in addition to that, Daniel talked about the coalition, the Fines and Fees Coalition. So Forward Justice is an anchor organization in the North Carolina Fines and Fees Coalition. And that coalition is really a group of community advocates, impacted people, researchers, attorneys, organizers, and we're devoted to just eliminating fines and fees in the criminal justice system. And so we try to do that with a variety of tactics. We try to utilize campaign building, research, policy advocacy, and litigation, as I mentioned. So on February 13th of this year, we had a convening in Greensboro where we officially launched a campaign to end criminal justice debt in North Carolina. And so some of our larger coalition goals have been to, and I don't remember if Daniel or Christy mentioned this, but develop a standard process for ability to pay, which was kind of our main focus before this pandemic hit. We want to eliminate certain fines and fees that exist. As we mentioned, they have gone up, and so we want to eliminate some of them. We want to end punitive practices for failure to pay. So like I was mentioning, people get incarcerated, not supposed to, but for failing to pay, and just other punitive practices just because they don't have the money. And again, that is criminalization and punishing you for being poor. And then also retroactively waiving fines and fees for those unable to pay. Daniel mentioned how, after about a year, you're unlikely to really go back and pay that. So if we could just retroactively waive some of that debt, give people a fresh start, go back to Second Chance Alliance, let's just give people a second chance. Those are some of the goals of the Alliance. And I think similar to the Second Chance Alliance, since COVID, the pandemic hit, we've kind of had to shift a little bit of what our work looks like. So the coalition, we're really concerned, obviously, about the economic impact of the pandemic. It's inevitably going to lead to more public safety and health issues, as Daniel mentioned earlier. If you're driving around without a license and you get into a car accident, you're not able to have insurance, a public safety issue. Additionally, if you are unable to pay these debts, and right now, as Christy mentioned, the number of unemployed people in North Carolina, and you are being hassled by the court system to pay debts with money that you don't have, you may also be encouraged to, go back and do things that you did to get in the criminal justice system in the first place. And that's not something that we want to encourage. And so in light of this pending recession that we're facing, we have recommended as a coalition some broad policy changes in order to mitigate this impact of this recession. So we have sent letters with policy recommendation to a couple of the House Select Committees on COVID-19 at the North Carolina General Assembly. We've also sent letters to the Department of Motor Vehicles, law enforcement officers, both the Sheriff's Association and Association of Police Chiefs, the North Carolina League of Municipalities, and the Association of County Commissioners, just asking for suspension in debt collection, suspension in driver's license revocation, and other practices that are really going to be burdensome in light of the economic crisis brought on by COVID-19. So we're still working and planning to send more letters with policy recommendations to other decision makers, but really realizing the importance of decarceration being kind of a priority right now to save lives, and then following up with some of these other decision makers about the economic impact and how they can be helpful to change some policies for people. So I think the coalition as a whole is really excited about the launch of your website. It's actually an agenda item to talk about in our meeting today in about 20 minutes. And so we're excited to utilize some of that available data in our advocacy going forward.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Whitley. Let's turn to you, Joanna, to talk about work in North Carolina, but also the work that you're doing in places similarly hit by this type of criminal justice debt around the country.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this report, which is really a model for other places to try to do a really comprehensive look and prove out how fines and fees are impacting local communities. And I think, I just congratulate you between that and the tremendous organization that you all are doing in North Carolina. I really have hope because it's very clear that the problem in North Carolina is particularly acute. But I think in light of this crisis, of the COVID crisis, as both Christy and Whitley really pointed out, we're facing the worst economic and health crisis that we've seen in modern history. And just as your report pointed out, that fines and fees are disproportionately falling on vulnerable communities, particularly low-income people and people of color. The exact same thing is happening with the COVID crisis. People who work in low-wage workers, typically in low-wage jobs, typically can't work remotely. They're much more susceptible to being exposed to the virus. And in fact, in the places where they've looked at demographic data of who's been killed by the virus, Black people are overrepresented by about a factor, by about 100%. They're doubly represented in the death rates in the places that are keeping demographic data, which looks very similar to the overrepresentation we see on the burden of fines and fees on Black people as well. So at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we have come up with a list of 12 recommendations for what local government can do now. And obviously we encourage any activists to use this and share it. You guys are a little bit ahead of the game, having already really come up with your own recommendations locally, which is fantastic. But just nationally, some of the things that can happen by local government. The first thing is that government should really discharge all of the outstanding debt. As multiple people have mentioned on this call, this is largely uncollectible debt. It's disproportionately falling on people that will never be able to pay it, which is why we have more and more draconian means of collecting that debt. Because when you can't collect debt, you have to do harsher and harsher things to try to coerce those payments, which is why we see things like driver's license suspensions and jailing people for non-payment. If you can't discharge all that debt, the thing that government can do right now is end collections. Suspend all collections of fines, fees, and court debt. Suspend all payment plans, wage garnishment, property liens, any offsets to tax refunds, all of the ways that money right now can be collected depending on the jurisdiction where you live. You should stop sending delinquent cases to private debt collection companies. And you have to notify those private collection companies, as well as probation and parole officers, to stop all collections. And there should also be a suspension of all interest on unpaid fines, fees, and court debt. The other thing that everyone should be doing is to stop issuing and enforcing any warrants for unpaid fines and fees or failure to appear at a hearing to address unpaid fines and fees. The next thing is, and this has come up a lot in this conversation, is state and local jurisdictions should stop suspending driver's licenses. Obviously, if we want people to access their basic necessities and work while social distancing, they're going to need access to their cars, and they need to be able to get in their cars and drive without risk of arrest and further justice involvement. Anyone who's stopped with driving on a suspended license for non-payment should be simply issued a warning and let go. No one should be cited or more penalized or brought into the system, worse, arrested for driving on a suspended license throughout this crisis. We have to stop issuing parking tickets and municipal code violations and imposing more fines and fees on people when they especially can't afford it. And any cases that are being heard right now, judges really need to be reducing and especially waiving fines and fees and considering people's economic circumstance in light of the crisis. And all of these reforms should be made public so that people know their rights, so that when they go to court, they know what they can ask for and what they're entitled to given the crisis. The other thing is that for people who are currently incarcerated, as Christy pointed out, are facing particular vulnerability to both the health and the health impact in particular. Jails need to suspend all co-payments for medical visits. Everyone should be able to access the medical care that they need. Incarcerated people have to be provided liquid soap, hand sanitizer, and any disinfecting products that they need free of charge. The other thing is that people who are incarcerated and their families need to be provided with free phone calls. Jail visits have been suspended around the country for health reasons. We need to know that our loved ones who are incarcerated are safe, and people who are incarcerated need to know that their loved ones outside are safe and be able to talk to them and maintain contact. We have to release anyone who is incarcerated for outstanding fines and fees, and no probation or parole should ever be extended for non-payment of fines and fees or other technical violations that aren't a public safety issue. Those are things that can be done around the country now by local and state government. And the encouraging thing is that in many places, those reforms are starting to happen. Just recently in Maine, they vacated 12,500 warrants that were set for failure to pay or failure to appear. We certainly don't want to be inducting anyone into the system right now where it's less safe. And we should be doing everything to reduce the size of the justice system right now. So that's a great measure. There are many states and localities that are no longer referring licenses for suspension. Oregon has stopped doing it. Minnesota has stopped doing it. Several parts of Florida have stopped referring licenses for suspensions, and even some places in New York. A county in California recently discharged millions of dollars in existing debt. And they pointed out that in light of the crisis, that debt was really never going to be collected. And so reducing the burden to low-income people during the crisis made sense. The same thing, Ramsey County just eliminated parole and probation fees and eliminated debt associated with it. And while that was a reform that they had been working on for a long time, when they announced it, they announced that in light of the crisis, these kinds of fees, particularly now, need to disappear. There are counties that are offering flexible payment plans and suspending all payments for a long period of time and putting in lower amounts, reduced amounts for after the crisis wanes, knowing that people's economic circumstances are going to go down. And in many jails, they're providing free phone calls to people in light of the crisis. These are sort of the simple things that every jurisdiction should be looking into doing now. And when we look around the state, we've started to track the reforms that are happening around the country, and we found reforms in more than half the states already related to fines and fees. And in North Carolina, the only reform that we've seen so far is delaying payment by 90 days. And that's, you know, a helpful step in light of the crisis, but it doesn't go nearly far enough, because when the immediate health crisis ends, the economic crisis will simply be growing. And so pushing off the debt for 90 days is not going to help people in the long run. So we need to do better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Let me turn things over to you, Tom, to pose the question, what do we do next to the group?
Certainly, and I want to join Brandon in thanking you all for joining us and for your interest and work on this issue. The report obviously predates the pandemic and shows even without the pandemic, the scope of this issue, and the pandemic has highlighted it. And in a moment, I want to give those of you who want to a chance to talk about what people who are interested can do about this. But first, you know, the importance of this is probably reflected by some of the action that our Chief Justice Beasley, has taken. On April 2nd, she entered an order with a number of emergency directives, one of which was directed specifically at this issue. And there are a number of details to it, but in general, it has granted a 90-day reprieve on the payment of court debt. So if court debt isn't paid, it can't be treated as willful. Judgments can't require court debt to be due sooner than 90 days. Failures to pay can't be reported. And so at least for that time period, there's been some important relief granted here in North Carolina, but it's modest. 90 days will go by quickly. Regardless of what happens with the pandemic, as a number of you have mentioned, the economic fallout is going to continue for a long time. And this is not just a health issue, but an economic issue. Certainly, that order may be extended, given that we don't yet know, and the courts don't yet know when things will return to whatever the new normal will be. But at some point, these emergency directives will end, and we'll be back to facing this issue. So you all have talked about what you've been doing, your organizations have been doing, recommendations. I guess I want to give you a moment. Yes, Brandon. Are you not hearing me?
Brandon, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Oh, yeah. Brandon?
Sorry about that. I realized Christina hasn't talked yet, and I don't know how that happened, and I apologize. And please, we really want to hear from you before we turn to the host.
Why don't I do this? I'm going to turn to Christina first to answer the question and let her talk about it. The question is what can be done both by your organizations, and you've talked some about it, but by people who are interested. Who could they speak out to? What actions can they take? And let me start with Christina. You can talk some. You've done, as Brandon mentioned, a powerful report that illustrates it at a personal level, the impact of this beyond the data. So let me turn it over to you, Christina. And you need to unmute, Christina.
I said I thought maybe I was just invited just to hang out, which I was totally fine with. So good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you. It's really nice to see you. And thank you to Duke and Brandon and Will and your team for the good work you've done, because when I started doing this, no data was available. It was, scraping and begging for anything. And so to see it more comprehensive data and displayed so well is exciting to me. But I think the disappointing thing about this whole, about fines and fees in North Carolina is one that I feel like I spent most of my time as a public defender trying to dodge fines and fees for my clients, and trying to be really creative about ways in which they can avoid having to pay money because they didn't have it. And when I started investigating for the report, I think the thing that became really clear right away was that how intentional these efforts were, how everything was systematically set up to squeeze pennies from poor people, particularly Black and brown people. And it reminded me of this, and I used to have this sort of picture hanging up in my office. I remember when I was a kid and I saw the cartoon movie Robin Hood, and there's one scene where the sheriff comes around, he's collecting taxes, and he goes up to someone who has a cast on, who's elderly, who has health problems, and he says he doesn't have any money, and the sheriff lifts up his cast, and one coin falls out. And he takes that one last coin. And I remember what an impact that had on me when I was a kid. And that's kind of how I see all of this playing out in and I'd like to say a less dramatic fashion, but I actually don't think that's the case. So looking at the graphs that you guys did, I see that we're not really improving that much. And so all the systems that were set in place to intentionally squeeze money out of people, it worked. So, the sort of what Daniel was talking about with the strong arming of judges to be debt collectors by the legislature, how the required costs keep going up, the number of costs keep going up. And Whitley talked about punitive measures, that those increased. But the interesting thing is that you can't take money where there is no money, right? And that seems to be a lesson that they never learn from year to year, which is truly appalling in and of itself. So a little bit about sort of like the sort of structural things that are in place that I saw that has led to the increase in incarcerated people because of this are certainly because of these efforts, but also just sort of what's happening in the individual courts and the judges' tendencies to, let's say, ignore the Constitution. So I think the first thing is starting off with like the thing that's right in front of our faces, which is that judges are jailing people for being poor. That despite, a landmark case that we have that instructs the judges that they can't indeed incarcerate people simply because they don't have the ability to pay. But what we know is when I started doing this work, and I'm guaranteed that it still happens on a daily basis, I know it does, is that they're still doing it, that they're jailing people, that they don't ask them whether or not they can pay. And in many circumstances, particularly when you're in in counties that are poor, that are some of the poorest counties in the state, where either employment is low because there just aren't opportunities, and the opportunities that were there have left, so there's no more industry, and then the employment opportunities that are left don't pay livable wages. This is something that everybody in the county knows, but if you're standing in a courtroom, it's like all of this is happening in a vacuum. This sort of backdrop of poverty is never recognized. It's never addressed at all by the judges. All they do is say, do you have the money for me? And when I use the term debt collector, I'm not being hyperbolic. And one of the judges that I observed was called the best debt collector in the state, by the elected district attorney. So this is a job that everybody knows they have. It's it's public, it's recognized, and no one's doing anything about it. They seem pretty comfortable in that position. And so jailing poor people because they're poor is definitely one of the main unconstitutional practices I saw. Another is using fines and fees and inability to pay to force people to become witnesses. Something I didn't really talk about too much in the report, but one thing I saw over and over again is the subpoena of witnesses, particularly domestic violence witnesses or alleged victims in these cases. And some of them didn't come to court for whatever reason, as they were afraid, or because maybe they were the only person providing childcare, not that they're separated from their spouse or partner, or maybe they had to work, or and maybe they're the only wage earner in the family now because the other person's incarcerated. So for whatever reason, they didn't come. So what was happening is that some DAs were then having them arrested for not coming in, charging them for a non-compliance fee of $200, and then pay bail. And if they had some sort of additional charge on top of, obstruction of justice or something like that, they were having to pay even more. So even paying the sort of administrative costs or the general court costs. So it was just sort of this just really unpalatable manipulation of witnesses. And I'm guessing that domestic violence cases are probably not the only ones they're using that for. Also, just that that there was just a complete lack of ability to pay hearings, both on the front end when they're being sentenced and on the back end. So what's interesting in North Carolina, I think when people think of fines and fees, they think of, traffic fine, and then often they think of restitution. So if, if there's a person-to-person crime where someone is injured and that person has to pay restitution, even in that circumstance, at least in North Carolina, there must be an inability to pay hearing before they determine restitution, which I think restitution is certainly a cost that more people are more emotional about, right? More than, paying for the sheriff's, retirement fund. So what's interesting is that hasn't trickled down to just basic general court costs. And it's inexplicable as to why. I think it's because so many of these laws sort of showed up piecemeal, because as the state lowered the tax rate that corporations needed to pay, then a lot of agencies started to become underfunded, including education and the court system. And instead of getting money from people who have it, they try to get it from people who don't. And so people are languishing in jails because of that. And so just trying to put all of this in context to what's happening now. And so Whitley and Chrissy talked a lot about what we're facing during the pandemic and how the people in jail and prisons are particularly vulnerable. So one of the things I'm working on right now is actually COVID litigation. So for the past 4 or 5 days, all I've been doing is basically staffing a hotline and asking people in jail what the conditions are like, and if the jail is even adhering to any COVID requirements. And I think we know the answer to that. And it's not even like they're trying their best with what they have. They just don't care, and they're not telling anybody anything. Nobody's informed. I talked to someone last night who was in a quarantine unit that was not being told he was being in a quarantine unit, he had not been told he was exposed. He has not been tested for the virus. And they're just basically sitting there in a death trap. And he's in there for a pretty minor charge. And I think about then, you know, what people are basically in jail waiting to get this disease because they haven't paid us our data connectivity fee. You know, I mean, it's just so ludicrous, and we should all be outraged. And so I understand the Chief Justice has addressed it a little bit, but as Joanna said, it's just not enough. Suspending these payments that are disproportional anyway is not going to really help somebody. And so one of the men in the report that that is on the cover of the report, I'm still representing him in Fines and Fees Matters, and I haven't been at the North Carolina office in almost a year now. But this still affects people, just the average everyday person, every single day.
And thank you for that. I guess before I move on from you, I want to give you a chance, if people are interested, either people who currently work in the system or just people in the community, in doing something about this, could you identify some action that could be taken or some issue that could be pushed by folks who are not directly involved in this group?
I feel like Whitley would be really good to answer that.
Yes.
Hey, let me go to Whitley. Whitley, can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And I think Christy can also help me with this. She's an amazing organizer and has just done a lot of work on the ground in Mecklenburg County. I know we mentioned Chief Justice Beasley's order, but even prior to that, there was an order by the Chief District Court Judge in Orange County. And so, one of our thoughts was, if we don't have something statewide, then we can organize people in every county across the state to advocate with their Chief District Court Judge to implement orders that suspend debt. And that can still be done to go beyond what Justice Beasley has ordered statewide. And so I think here I want to pitch on May 7th, the Fines and Fees Coalition is actually going to host on Zoom an In Criminal Justice Debt North Carolina community action event to talk about just this, how people can get involved in their local communities, kind of given the COVID crisis, given we can't, go out and have community meetings and community trainings. Christy will be a part of that, talking about some of her advocacy strategies and what can be done on the local level in this kind of teleworking environment to make some local change. So if you, or if anyone is interested in that or sharing that, I would recommend going to our coalition's website, which is endcriminaljusticedebtnc.org, and just sign up to be a part of our listserv. And we will be sending out that information in the next week about that community action event.
And I'll just add to what Whitley is saying is that, oh, go ahead, Whitley.
So I want to apologize, but I'm actually supposed to be chairing the Fines and Fees meeting right now, so I'm going to have to exit. But I appreciate you having me here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I will see you all soon.
Thank you so much, Whitley.
Thank you.
I'm also supposed to be on that call, so I'll be jumping off, but I wanted to add to what Whitley said is that we do have things that can be done at the local level. What I started out just doing is just asking my local DA, did you know that people who don't pay their fees and fines over 2 years old never will? And here's the empirical evidence to support it. It's not my work, it's not my words, this is what the people found. These researchers who we value, this is what they said, right? And so he then decided, okay, but it was not just because I asked him, it's because he knows that we build collective power in Mecklenburg County and that our advocacy is strong in Mecklenburg County and that we're gonna stand on his neck until he takes his part in getting off of our necks, right? And so what I want people to understand is that what we're asking for is not radical, but it is a paradigm shift. The things we're asking for are things that should have been happening all along. You heard Christina say that these things are unconstitutional, which means they are unlawful. And it's never lost on me how much grace system actors and elected officials request when their practices are unlawful and unconstitutional, but fail to display that same grace to poor Black and brown people across North Carolina and across this country. They are asking for things that they cannot give. And so what my answer to that is to not give them our collective power, which is our vote. So judges are up in 2020. Go to court watching when the courts open back up, or talk to local defense attorneys and public defenders in your area to see which judges are bad, because they know which ones are bad. Get educated, because if they are willing to be unlawful and unconstitutional, then that means that they are not fit to serve. They are violating the oath that they took, all kind of ethical violations, and we let that happen. And if it were me, you would lock me up. So what I'm asking all attorneys, people with power, people on the ground, use your knowledge, educate yourself, become engaged, civically engaged. I know there are barriers, but people like me will help you. I will help you get to the poll. I will help you learn about this situation, because you have to know that they are systematically trying to extract your wealth, dehumanize and demoralize you through this process. And so that's why it's important to get involved, because they are holding you to a standard that they do not hold themselves to. Thank y'all. I appreciate y'all so much for letting me come, but I do have to jump.
Thank you so much, Christy.
We probably have just a few more minutes. I know people are busy working on this. Does anyone else want to talk a bit about what folks who are interested in this can do, either in the short term during the pandemic or in the long term as we continue to deal with this issue outside of the pandemic?
Hey, this is Daniel. You know, there has been progress in North Carolina on this issue, thanks to Christina's work and thanks to the Fines and Fees working group, and then Duke's work. And so one big step forward is that, and one problem that we had before was that there was no, in a unified court system that is completely dependent on standard forms, both the motion or petition form and the order form for judges, there was no forum for debt relief. There was no way for somebody to go in and ask for the court to consider their ability to pay. There was no way for the court to use a form to grant that relief. And so, and it's hard if you're not an attorney in North Carolina to understand, but there is a form for virtually everything, no matter how minute of a detail it is, there's a form for it. So that was a pretty glaring absence. And so one thing we did was ask the Forms and Fee, the Criminal Forms Committee of the Administrative Office of the Courts to develop that form, and working with the School of Government, which advises, is a great resource in North Carolina that advises judges and other actors in the court system and law enforcement. And so we've actually developed that form. In addition to, you know, Christina had worked with the School of Government to develop a monetary obligations bench card, which showed judges sort of what they could, you know, what fees they could waive and which ones couldn't be waived. And really, there's only one that cannot be waived. So there's a lot of opportunities there to just push those materials out, you know, to tell people who you know are going to court, hey, there's this ability. One thing we're looking at is an app where, which we do a lot of things, but one is, you know, when it sees that you're going into a courthouse, to show you the form and say, hey, you know, fees can be waived. Here's the form you would need to fill out. So trying to be very creative with providing those resources, but just having the form itself is huge, because before, what was happening, you go up to a clerk to say, hey, I owe this fee, I want to ask the court to waive it. Because there's no form, they would just assume there's no relief. I mean, that's how dependent North Carolina is on these forms, that if it doesn't have a form, it is as if the statute doesn't exist. And so just having the form, even if it's not sort of in wide circulation, is a huge step forward towards getting the clerks and the judges on board, because they, you know, what I've been surprised through learning about all this is, one, judges and clerks don't know about the face of poverty. And so what it means to not be able to pay, as Christina was hitting on. But then two, they're not trained in the law in many ways. Like, I think people will be shocked by how little training judges get when they take the bench, and how little sort of assistance there is between the judges. And so it is a quick learning curve. And so as much as we can make it easy to learn about fines and fees and court's ability to waive, I think that's helpful. And I think that's something the School of Government is looking at, because right now they estimate they spend about 30 minutes on legal financial obligations and a few minutes on the ability of judges to waive that. And so there's a huge amount of education that can be done by professionals, but also just activists and interested citizens around the state.
And thank you for that. And I was just going to say, before I turn it over to Brandon to wrap up, I want to give Joanna a moment to speak to what can be done.
So I think that, we've sort of talked about what's happening around the country and places that are moving on this issue. We've also started to create a bank of advocacy materials that groups around the country have used, some locally, some nationally. We'd love to add in the advocacy materials that are being used in North Carolina so that other places can learn from what you're doing and make sure that everyone on the ground in North Carolina has access to the resources that have been developed by other groups around the country. And all of that can be found on our website.
And thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Brandon to wrap up what's been a wonderful discussion.
I just want to thank you all for taking the time. And we certainly have our own wish list of aggressive recommendations. I would love to introduce the piece of legislation that says that judges can waive any fine or and must consider ability to pay anytime a fine or fee is imposed in a court in North Carolina. Authorizing judges to remit any prior court debt whenever a person demonstrates inability to pay. Legislation like that would go farther than the Second Chance Act, which has good provisions regarding the practice of suspending driver's licenses indefinitely. But to pass more comprehensive legislation ending that practice in North Carolina. Virginia just did it. Other states have done it. Joanna and her colleagues at the Fines and Fees Justice Center have worked on legislative efforts around the country. We haven't had farther reaching legislation here, and obviously the not as far reaching legislation hasn't passed in North Carolina yet. But maybe it says something to at least introduce it and get conversation started. We have a lot of work to do, and it's a exciting time. I hope that that we all keep having these conversations.